A world in which everybody can act for the sake of what they truly value is by definition a voluntary world, because acting for the sake of what you value requires being free from force. If one is forced, they are not acting for the sake of what they value. If you want universal authenticity, you need universal voluntary societies. Can authenticity be wrong? That is going to be the objection that we are going to try and answer today in this series on answering objections to the philosophy that I've laid out in previous videos. Today's structure is going to be pretty similar to the last ones. We're going to lay out the major objections that come up against the universal goodness of authenticity. These include social anarchy, violence, impulsiveness, and narcissism. And then we're going to move on to some general responses to these particular objections, including individual valuation, voluntarism, holism, and genuine altruism. All of these concepts we're going to get into more depth in this video. But as always, as you're watching this, if you have any comments, criticisms, further objections, or alternative suggestions to anything that I'm talking about here, then please put them down in the comments. Again, guys, I would love to be able to read those, have these conversations with you, discuss these different philosophical ideas, grow in my understanding and knowledge, and help you to grow in yours. So without further ado, we'll get straight into it with the first of our major objections here, which is going to be social anarchy. The objection of social anarchy essentially comes down to this idea that in life, people have certain obligations or duties to broader structures that they don't necessarily value themselves. So this can include something like a duty to a nation to protect and serve in the military in times of war. This can be a duty to love and care for your family or your parents, especially as they get old. This can be an obligation to God or the tenets of your religion. Another example would be an obligation to the law in order to maintain stability. There are many of these different kinds of social structures which seem to impose on us duties and obligations that we don't necessarily, from a day-to-day perspective, want to participate in, but which seem necessary anyway in order for society to be harmonious. And if we don't overcome our own authentic desires to be free from these kinds of structures, then all of these social structures which keep us together and functioning will disappear or fall apart, fall into disarray, and fall into a kind of social anarchy. Not only this, but if people are only following their authentic desires, then there's never room for sacrificing for the greater whole, because we're always focused on our own needs and our own wants, and we can't find something that transcends who we are. In short, if everybody was authentic all the time, then our social institutions would fall apart. The second major objection that we can lay out is the objection of violence. So this is the idea, or perhaps the question, what if I authentically desire to harm other people or to harm myself? What if I authentically desire violence and chaos and making trouble for people? Shouldn't my desire for authenticity be subordinate to a higher moral principle other than acting for the sake of what I desire? Because if I desire something that's harmful, if I desire something that's violent, then ultimately I'm going to do more bad for myself and for other people than the goodness I get out of authenticity in and of itself. And of course, if we took authenticity as a moral principle, then regardless of its good intentions, some people are going to use it as a justification to harm other people. They're going to use it as their principle. When we say, why did you attack this person? They'll say, well, it was just my authentic desire, and my authentic desire is a good thing, so there's no way that you can morally judge me for this. And really all this boils down to the question, don't we need some higher moral principle than just authenticity? The fourth objection we're going to talk about is impulsiveness. So this is the idea that isn't authenticity just impulsiveness? Isn't authenticity just acting on the first thing that comes to my mind? Whatever my instincts tell me, whatever my authentic instinct tells me, then that must be what is authentic. Must be what I actually desire, and I should act for the sake of it. And doesn't this kind of impulsiveness just drive me to act thoughtlessly, with no regard to my future, with no regard to my health, with no regard to the people around me. For instance, I get it into my head that I want to do some drugs or drink a lot of alcohol, and I just go for it because that's my authentic desire. And of course, that's going to have all of these negative consequences for myself down the line that I might regret later, and it might harm the people around me. So, how is authenticity different from just pure impulsiveness? And then the last major objection is going to be, isn't authenticity really just narcissism and selfishness? And you can say this is one of the running themes throughout the rest of the objections. But essentially, it's the question of, if I just focus on myself, don't I necessarily ignore the wants and needs of the people around me? If my moral principle is to act for the sake of what I value, doesn't this mean ignoring what other people value? Doesn't this mean using other people as objects to my own self satisfaction? And doesn't this kind of self obsession cut me off from other sources of genuine meaning in human life, like my family or my community, my nation, or the broader humanity, or just relationships in my life? Won't focusing solely on my own desires leave me isolated and alone and cut off from other people, especially if who I am is offensive to the people around me? Don't I have an obligation? And wouldn't it even be valuable to me to sacrifice my own desires for the sake of other people? And so those are the four major objections: social anarchy, violence, impulsiveness, and narcissism. And we are going to take these objections one by one and try to give a general response to it. Again, it's not really possible or practical for me to give a majorly comprehensive answer to each one of these objections, but I'm going to do my best to give a general response to you that's going to paint a picture of how I'm looking at these kinds of objections and how we can either overcome them, integrate them, or understand them to reveal their hidden mistakes. If you want a more detailed analysis of responses to these kinds of things, a more, you might say, principled analysis to it, then I would encourage you to actually go over to my Substack, where I do a lot of my writing. The benefits of writing is that you have the time and the space to detail out these kinds of objections and the philosophical responses. In these videos, I can only give general responses and a pragmatic vision that helps to illustrate the kind of moral principles that I'm talking about. So if you're interested in more detail, then I would encourage you to go over to my Substack and read the different articles there. So the first objection that we're going to tackle is the social anarchy. And my response to the objection of social anarchy is situated in something that I call individual valuation. And individual valuation is fancy philosophical speak, again, for the idea that all judgments of value come down to the individual, to the person. Everything that has been built by human beings, everything that has been pursued by human beings, including the social institutions in our lives, have been built up and pursued by individuals who valued their creation. Now, a lot of times, the way that these individuals went about creating these institutions is through violence, is through coercion, is through threats, and ostracism. And so forced or incentivized the people around them to conform with what they valued. But ultimately, the standard of whether or not any given social institution is of value or not comes down to the individual, comes down to whether or not they judge the institution desirable or beneficial to them and their values or not. If an individual does not value it, then there is no other standard by which to judge its value, because values and evaluation is ultimately and intrinsically an individual and human activity. We don't value things as groups. We don't value things as institutions. We don't value things conceptually. There is no abstract, objective realm of values which we can pick out and experience. It all comes down to an individual making a value judgment as to whether or not the social institution, the concept, the organization, the group that they want to involve themselves in or participate in is of value and not. It's not a question of whether the individual judges it valuable or not. It comes down to a means. Does the individual have the moral right to use force and violence to impose that value on everybody else or not? And we'll get further into the answer to that question. But these institutions, and really anything, because they're ultimately built upon individual valuations, they will continue so long as people value them, so long as people are willing to participate in them because they authentically value them, then they will survive. And if the social structures that we have around us are not actually valuable to people, if they represent the false self or they represent the use of force and violence by another person, then they shouldn't survive because they're not built on a voluntary participation basis. They're not built on a genuine value, but they're built on fear, they're built on violence, they're built on force, they're built on coercion. And not only that, but alternatives have not been allowed to come about, have not been allowed for people to judge them. So if you took something like entertainment, for example, you take something like entertainment and you ask yourself, okay, imagine if there were only one one television channel, for example, one show you could watch. For whatever reason, they were only allowed to produce one TV show. And someone came along and said, hey, we shouldn't be forced to just watch this one TV show. It shouldn't just be this cultural institution that this TV show exists. People should be able to choose whether or not they want to watch this TV show or maybe make a different TV show or watch something else or use some other form of entertainment. The people around you who have experienced nothing other than that one form of entertainment or that one channel or whatever, they respond back to you that if we just allowed people to create whatever kind of entertainment they want, then and judge for themselves what was good and what was bad, then this not only would there be all of these other competing and disorganized shows and forms of entertainment, the consequences of which we wouldn't be able to measure, but many people would tune out of the original TV show and it might go away, it might lose its funding, it might not perform well compared to everything else that gets produced out of that. And who knows whether those other TV shows would really be good for people or really be uplifting and moral like the TV show that we've got right now. So let's just not do it, right? Let's just keep the institution where it is. Let's not allow people to act for the sake of what they value and make the judgment themselves. Let's just obligate everybody to watch the TV show that we already have. Sort of an obtuse example, but it gets at the same principle. The value of any kind of institution only ever comes down to what people get out of it, what it is that individuals value about it. And if they don't value it, then they go off to create alternatives. They go off to experiment with other different things. And insofar as that creation and participation is voluntary, then what is actually of value comes about. Whenever an institution is imposed on us, either by force or social obligation or some form of coercion or the supposed needs of survival, then valuable alternatives are not allowed to come about, are not allowed to replace the old with the new. And so the answer basically is that social institutions which cannot exist within a voluntary framework, social institutions which have no value to the individuals enough to survive, shouldn't survive. They shouldn't exist because they're not representative of people's individual values. And I want to take a particular example in talking about obedience to God's law as a Christian, because there might be some other Christians out there who would argue against this idea of authenticity by saying that you have an obligation to follow God's law, regardless of whether in any given moment you authentically desire to pursue that or not, because of course you have a sinful heart. So how could you might authentically value sin. And so you shouldn't be sinning and you shouldn't be following your authentic self. You should be following God's law. And the response that I would have to this is that the radical thing about Christ is that what he is asking you to do is not to trust in a law, not to be obligated to a law, but to trust in him, to put your faith in him and him alone. It is not about living up to an obligation that you don't actually value, which is the law. It is about putting your faith in somebody who has a greater righteousness than you. And so what you are authentically valuing as a Christian is not the law, but the person of Christ, meaning that when you are tempted to break a law and you follow Christ instead, this is not putting your authentic desire aside and pursuing an obligation unconnected to what you value. It is putting your trust in a person because you authentically trust the person completely. Christ being the only person you can trust authentically, completely. And so even in the case of following the commands of Christ, it is about authentically trusting in the person of Christ, not robotically acting on the law. This is part of the reason they say that the law kills, the letter of the law kills, but the spirit gives life. Another way you can frame this entire conversation is, what is the point of obligations? What is the point of social structures? What is the point of duties without the individual actively and desiringly participating in them? If there is no desire to participate, then what is the value of the obligation or the duty? The duty or the obligation can only be judged by the desiring individual, because all goodness reconciles itself down to that individual subjective judgment. All right, so we can move on to the second objection here, which is the objection of violence. What if I authentically wish to cause somebody harm? And my general response is that of voluntarism. And this involves a couple of different things here. First, it involves a examination of really where the desire to harm other people comes from. And what I will say is that it is virtually impossible for somebody to authentically desire to harm or use violence against another person. The desire to harm other people, to use force and violence against them, and to control them comes out of the false self, not the authentic self. Some examples you can use of this empirically is just to look at something like serial killers. If you take out a list of serial killers and you go through their childhoods, inevitably you will find significant amounts of child abuse, neglect, oftentimes physical abuse, sexual abuse. In the history of these kinds of people who are so motivated to harm, there is oftentimes a incredibly violent background, an incredibly controlling back. And so what the child learns in these circumstances is that if they are going to secure their own life, if they're going to secure the possibility of acting for the sake of values in the future, then they have to get dramatic control over the people around them. This is a psychological response to the fact that they had no control as a child, and that love and want associated with violence, domination, aggression, and control. Meaning to say that the thing which produces violence and harm is violence and harm, right? Hurt people hurt people. But this is not the way that children are born. This is not the way that people are natural. Naturally, most people are social, or at least willing to allow other people to act for the sake of what they value. And the vast majority of things that people act for, they can act for at the same time simultaneously without having to use force and violence against each other to get their ways. The vast majority of the source of harm and the desire to commit violence comes from the creation of the false self, the need that is perceived in the individual that they must use force and harm to control their environment, which existentially is not really the case. Another example that you can see this is in the histories of authoritarian countries like Russia and Germany. When we look at the parenting, the kinds of parenting techniques that were used in countries like Germany and Russia before the beginnings of World War I and World War II, they were greatly much more authoritarian, violent, and controlling than their European neighbors or North America. And you combine that with the right situational context of an authoritarian leader and the material base to be able to act on one's aggressive, controlling impulses on a national level, and you create the kind of country that is not only willing to go along with violence and control of one's neighbors, but actively and enthusiastically participates in it. Sadistic forms of parenting create a sadistic nation, a nation bent towards sadism. We can see this connection everywhere. If we got rid of the violence and the force and the coercion in the first place, there'd be far more room for pure authenticity that has nothing to do with force or harm. In fact, empathy is a consequence of authenticity, meaning the authentic instinct tries to get the truth of oneself and recognizes that one's meaning comes out of producing one's value. When one is able to recognize that within oneself, when one recognizes that the whole meaning and value of one's life comes from knowing yourself and being able to act for the sake of it in the world, then this naturally translates to an understanding of the people around you. When you believe that your happiness or your life depends on whether or not you can control people, and you believe that people are constantly going to use violence and control against you, then when you grow up, you project this understanding onto the people around you as a whole. And there is no empathy because there is no understanding of the self, because the self is not geared towards acting for the sake of what you value, but of securing your survival by controlling the people around you. When you understand who you are, you do not need to control other people. Empathy becomes a result of authenticity. And lastly, I would say that some people, they might have a narrow sense of what it means to act for the sake of what one values. A value, the thing that a person is acting for, the thing that a person desires, is often more abstract than the concrete thing that they end up achieving. Meaning that a person can act for something that ends up being different when it comes about. So you might have a desire to get fit, for example, but there are a lot of different ways of going about that. You can go for a walk, you can go kayaking, you can take up boxing, you can start cycling. So the actual ways in which you go about getting fit are tremendously diverse. And so even if a person has a sort of dark impulse, quote unquote, whatever that's supposed to mean, there are different ways to achieving it than hurting or harming other people. And it's easy enough to change one's means based on that. So if you have, you might say, oh, well, some people, they just want to harm because of the thrill of it, right? But there's other ways to get thrills, right? They can go do extreme sports or something like that. So the motivation is never really about they have this desire, so they must harm and use violence. There's not a necessary connection between those two. If they have a desire for thrill, if they have a desire for horror, if they have a desire for the dark or disturbing, there are a variety of ways that that desire can become manifested in a way that doesn't harm or hurt people. If you have a desire for horror, you can make a horror movie, right? There are consensual forms of activity, so to speak, that satisfy these desires. So it's not really about the desires themselves, it's about what the particular forms of harm and violence are actually achieving. And in nearly all cases, it is about some form of control. If you can root out the origin of the control, which is violence and harm itself, especially at the parenting level, then you can root out 90 of so-called authentic violence. Not only that, but a voluntary society allows for a greater diversity of options whenever it comes to any problem. So there might be a survival issue, right? And you might get into a situation where it seems like it's me against you, and we have to harm each other, or one person has to kill the other person in order to get this thing that we need for our own survival. But again, almost always there is an alternative option to that. Almost always there is another way out. And almost always, like, those conditions of me against you are artificially constructed in the first place. If the government puts a force-based tariff on agricultural imports, and then there happens to be a failure of a crop, and now people are hungry and at each other's throats, this had its origins in violence and force in the first place. And I would challenge you to investigate these scenarios in which people are at each other's throats and see if you can't find the violent origin of it to begin with. If we address the problem of violence to begin with by creating a voluntary society, then the so-called needs of violence will disappear. But this idea of voluntarism, this idea of a universal freedom from coercion, force, and violence is not actually an additional principle that we tack on to authenticity. I don't want you to get the mistaken idea that we have authenticity and then we also need voluntarism to complete it. It's the complete opposite. The goodness, the universal goodness of authenticity gives rise to the universal condition of voluntarism, meaning that a world in which everybody can act for the sake of what they truly value is by definition a voluntary world. it is by definition a world that is completely free from the use of force, coercion, and violence, because acting for the sake of what you value, by definition, requires being free from force. If one is forced, if one has coercion put against oneself, necessarily they are not acting for the sake of what they value. If you want universal authenticity, you need universal voluntary societies. And so authenticity is the ultimate path to nonviolence. Authenticity is not just the solution to a solution to violence, it is the solution to violence. It roots out the violence that could be inherent in the parent-child relationship, and it roots out the violence that is inherent in the state-citizen relationship. Voluntarism is not just an extra principle on top of authenticity. Voluntarism is the universal consequence of authenticity. If you want to prevent violence, then you must promote authenticity. These are inextricably connected to one another. So we'll move on to the next objection, which is impulsiveness. So this is the idea that if I am simply acting on what I desire, then I'm just bound to be impulsive. Whatever comes to my head, I'm going to act for the sake of. And this can include things that are going to be bad for me, like alcohol and drugs, or stealing from work, or being rude and untactful. And really, what is the difference between impulsivity on the one hand and authenticity on the other? Well, the main point I would make against this is that authenticity is not about acting about on the first thought that comes to your head. It's about considering the whole person. If we go back to how we define the self, I define the self as the total self. And if we go back to what I defined as the authentic instinct, I talked about the authentic instinct as the instinct to consciously know the total self as far as possible and to act for the sake of it. Impulsivity is when you are simply acting on one part, or really just the momentary part that shows up. And this is actually a result of the false self. It's not too different from instinct. When we're acting on instinct, this is a part of the false self. The false self is interested in self-preservation. And so when a tiger is chasing you, your entire consciousness gets focused on this aspect of fear and the desire to move away. And the false self comes in to protect you from self-preservation. It blocks out the vast majority of other considerations in your mind and your personality in order to get away from the tiger. This is a very natural thing. And impulsivity is another form of this kind of instinct. It's a false self instinct. It is, I'm not going to think about all the other things that I value, all the other things that I desire, my value hierarchy, the other things that I'm aiming for. And I'm just going to act on this one part that shows up. This is a form of cutting off the total self. And so it has very little to do with authenticity and everything to do with the false self and the false self instinct. If you want to be fully authentic, what you're looking for is a trending towards what I call rational holism. And holism is the answer to impulsiveness. Holism is the deliberate coming to know oneself and the integration of oneself. As we talked about in the last video, there's a kind of value hierarchy that sits within the total self, or I think this was 2 videos ago, but it sits within the self, and deliberately trying to understand and integrate that value hierarchy is the process of coming to know the total self. Acting on the value hierarchy and not just one part of that is more authentic because it includes more of who you actually are rather than just a cut off, circumscribed part of who you are. A person who is acting impulsively is acting on a cut off part of themselves and is therefore acting inauthentically, not authentically. And the last objection we'll hit here is the objection of narcissism, which I'm going to answer with the idea of genuine altruism. Again, narcissism, the objection of narcissism is basically asking, what is the difference between authenticity and selfishness, authenticity and self-focus, and pure egoism? Now, I consider myself an egoist in the philosophical tradition, meaning that I believe that the highest good is to act for the sake of what one values, and that all goodness is ultimately reconciled to individual valuation. But yet, there is a difference between egoism on the one hand and narcissism on the other hand. And there is a form of genuine altruism that is a result of egoism, as well as a sort of inauthentic and fake kind of altruism, which can be toxic to the person, which can be considered almost the antithesis of what it means to live a meaningful life. But genuine altruism is this idea that, the vast majority of people that you meet value other people. They value relationships. some more than others. There are, of course, some people who are more gregarious and social and interested in other people. And there are other people that are more inwardly focused and self reflective and like maybe a small amount of intimate relationships. But virtually everybody has this desire for community, for relationship with other people. And oftentimes, if there's an extreme version of either so much social gregariousness that there is no time for self maintenance or self reflection, or else complete total isolation, these two are themselves false self responses that come about from trauma, force, and violence and manipulation as children. But the point is to say that the vast majority of people do genuinely value other people. And the fact that they value other people is the seed of genuine altruism, the desire to see other people happy, to see other people thriving, to interact with people, and to know that their actions and behaviors contribute positively to the people, the community, and the world around them. These videos are an example of that for me. I believe that philosophy is something that, if you can get engaged in, can meaningfully improve your life. And I genuinely, as a part of my authentic self, want to see other people be able to benefit from philosophy and to be able to benefit from conversations about goodness and meaning in life. But that valuation comes from me. That would be genuine or authentic altruism. Comparing that to narcissism, narcissism is a form of the false self. It is a form of cutting off oneself. Again, virtually everybody has a desire for community and for relationship with other people. And so if you are entirely self-focused, if your behavior is entirely focused on how it relates to you directly, then there's an entire part of yourself which you are not recognizing. There's entire relationships that you have to other people that you are not recognizing and integrating into a fuller understanding of yourself. This doesn't mean that you should just be altruistic and self-sacrificial for its own sake. This is what we would call the inauthentic altruism, where really you're trying to help people either because you're afraid of them, because they're forcing you to, or because you feel as though you have a debt obligation to them. And again, none of this is really going to bring you any meaning or fulfillment. As soon as the obligation goes away, as soon as the fear goes away, as soon as the external force goes away, you run in the other direction. What you want is to try to figure out or acknowledge the genuine roots of love and care and interest in other people, which again, virtually every person has. What is love if it is not authentic? What is care for other people if it is inauthentic? What is desire to help other people if it is inauthentic? It's empty, it's meaningless, and it's void of any value. If we're interested in living a meaningfully good life, then even our altruism must be rested in what we value about other people, not simply a debt obligation. And a last tidbit I would say here is that even if you had a person, again, I think this would be virtually very rare, but even if you had a person who genuinely, authentically desired isolation, that in and of itself, sort of by definition, would do no harm to them. So long as they're not using violence and force against other people, so long as they are not coercing other people to participate with them or to be objects to them, then, which is again part of what it means to be authentic, then they could do really no harm to people around them. And again, if it's a genuine desire of theirs, then they're going to be perfectly fulfilled in that kind of social isolation. So even the worst scenario that we can think about here has no actual downsides to it. But authenticity is distinguished from narcissism precisely because it is situated in a genuine desire for other people and a genuine self-desire for other people, not simply an obligation. Now, the one thing that I would say is that oftentimes the social isolation, as I talked about before, is a place of the false self. It kind of comes out of childhood trauma and what you needed to become in order to please other people, or maybe the strategies you needed in order to retain the space for authenticity in your childhood. And so the false self can come in to develop social isolation patterns in the future that have nothing to do with the threats to authenticity in the present. And this is why I'm going to reinforce here the importance of testing, right? You have an idea that social isolation is making you happy, but you have the experience of being alienated, being cut off, being anxious, and feeling meaningless. Well, this is a signal to test social interaction, right? Either to go figure out how to do it, talk about it with somebody and its connection to your past, go out and socialize in small ways to see whether or not that brings you any meaning or value. Do this repeatedly. And it's the same thing on the other side of the spectrum, where if you are super social and you're constantly surrounded by other people and you have no time for personal reflection, you have no time to consider who you actually are. Oftentimes, this too is a form of the false self personality that is projecting itself onto other people as a way to distract from self awareness and self consciousness. A lot of people have the experience of not feeling like they can be alone and having the fear and anxiety around being alone or being with their own thoughts. Largely, this comes out of the fear of self examination. The false self saying, if I have the time to examine myself, I'm going to understand the truth of myself, which is going to put me in danger. And so the person who is overly social, maybe they have a lot of anxiety, maybe they don't feel together, maybe they don't have a strong sense of self, testing their gregariousness can itself be important as well. Giving oneself the deliberate moments of solitude, talking to somebody about the feeling of needing to be around people. This can give you insight as to what parts here are authentic or not. And of course, it can be a mix, but helps you distinguish between the two. All right, so those are my general responses to these kinds of objections to the goodness of authenticity. But what are your thoughts? I'm really interested again to get you guys' comments and criticisms about this. So any thoughts that you have, please put them down in the comments. I would be more than happy to respond, more happy just to engage in these conversations about ideas with you guys. The next objection that we're going to address is whether or not the government or the state is good or necessary. I've talked about how a voluntary society is the natural consequence of a full authenticity, and this implies a society without the state or without a force-based government. But of course, there are a lot of people out there who would say that government is necessary. The state is necessary for society to function and for people to have their freedoms. So is this true? That's the objection that we're going to get into in the next video. But always, guys, thank you for listening. If you liked what I was talking about here, then please give this video a like. If you have any thoughts, criticisms, concerns, put it down in the comments. I would love to respond to you guys. If you think somebody else would get some value out of this video, please share it with them. And if you like more videos like this in the future, please subscribe. So again, thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.